Welcome to Sports Beat KC, the Kansas City Star Sports podcast presented by First Federal Bank. It's Monday, July 25th, and I'm Blair Kirchhoff. Buck O'Neil finally got his day in Cooperstown. On Sunday, the former Kansas City Monarchs player and manager, Major League coach and scout, and baseball's greatest ambassador, not to mention Negro Leagues Baseball Museum founder, was enshrined with the class of 2022. This happened 16 years after Buck was not included in a special class of former Negro League figures, an omission that hurt those who knew Buck more than it did him. Still, Sunday's event was so satisfying on many levels, and on today's show, you're going to hear from folks who helped tell his story and have kept it alive over the years. We have a couple of segments today, courtesy of star columnist Vahe Gregorian. He was on hand to cover the weekend in Cooperstown, and his work is featured on kansascity.com. Well, this weekend, Vahe also doubled as a sound technician. So you'll hear a conversation he recorded about Buck between Negro Leagues Museum President Bob Kendrick and Joe Posnanski, the former star columnist who traveled the country with Buck O'Neil to write the book The Soul of Baseball. After a break, you'll hear Vahe's conversation with filmmaker Ken Burns. It was O'Neil's appearances on the documentary miniseries Baseball that thrust Buck O'Neil into the national limelight. Burns explains how he met Buck and about his impact on the project. But we can't have a show about Buck O'Neil without hearing from the legend, so let's start by playing a clip from Baseball by Ken Burns. It's the famous story about the sound Buck heard just 3 times in his life.
After the Black Sox scandal, here comes Ruth. I heard Ruth hit the ball. I'd never heard that sound before. And I was outside the fence, but it was a sound of the bat that I had never heard before in my life. That was Ruth hitting the ball. And the next time I heard that sound, I'm in Washington, D.C. I rushed out, and there was Josh Gibson hitting the ball. And I heard this sound again. Now, I didn't hear it anymore. I'm in Kansas City, and I heard this sound one more time that I hadn't heard only twice in my life. Now, you know who this is? Bo Jackson swinging at that. And now I heard this sound. It was a thrill for me. I said, here it is again. I heard it again. I've only heard it 3 times in my life. But now I'm living because I'm going to hear it again one day if I live long enough.
75. Shot 94 at age 94. And the day that he shoots 94, which was the last round of golf he and I ever played before he passed away in 2006. We're sitting down at dinner, and he looks up at us and he says, well, fellas, I shoot my age, but that ain't a good score anymore. And I'm like, Buck, if I make 94, I would love to tell somebody I shot 94. There are some days when I play now that I take 94. And so, but I think the thing that I remember the most is that you always felt better leaving Buck than you did when you came to see him. That there was something very innate about this man. And honestly, I liken it to the same qualities of a Mother Teresa, a Gandhi, a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You don't really know what it is, but you feel it when you're in their presence. And I talk about this all the time, and I'm sure Dr. Reverend Hill can relate to this. I believe that we're all here for a purpose. I really do. I subscribe wholeheartedly to that belief that we're here, each and every one of us are here for a purpose. Now, sometimes in this crazy life, we don't always readily identify with that purpose. Other times, we run from that purpose. But Buck O'Neil embraced his purpose. And then he lived it to the very fullest, so that we all could see that you could indeed get further in this life with love than you could with hate. And that is what drove him. It really did. The baseball thing, he loved what he was able to accomplish as a player, as a manager, as a scout, as a groundbreaking coach in baseball. He loved and relished. He would tell you his greatest accomplishment was building the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But what drove him was using his life to help others, to inspire, to encourage, to instill hope and belief. You know, that is what drove him. And he just identified with that purpose. And I asked him, I said, well, Buck, where did that come from? Y'all know what he told me? He said, my daddy told me when I was a little boy, treat every man the way you want to be treated. The golden rule. Yeah. And we all know the golden rule. We just don't all live the golden rule. And he took something that his father said to him when he was just a boy, and it governed him throughout the rest of his illustrious life.
Incredible, incredible. All right, before we go, we're gonna have to go here. But before we go, there is one other thing I want to say. We're here in Cooperstown, which Buck loved, by the way. Buck loved Cooperstown, loved the Hall of Fame. Such a joy for him to go into the Hall of Fame. And the day that Buck fell short in 2006, which we don't want to talk about, because that Buck wouldn't want us talking about that. That's not. But that day, people kept talking because they all thought he was going to go into the Hall of Fame, and they kept saying to Buck, what a deserving honor. You've been such a great spokesman for the game. You've been an ambassador to baseball. And they kept saying that, ambassador to baseball. You've been an ambassador to baseball. And Buck finally just loses it. And Buck goes, hey, I could play.
I think Buck got tired of all that ambassador.
He didn't want all that. He's like, all right, ambassador, but I could play.
I could play.
And
he could play.
He could. Well, I think it's really important to say that. You know, Buck was Buck a Hall of Fame player? He would tell you no. Was Buck a very good player? He would tell you yes. He was a great fielding first baseman, 300 hitter, won a batting title in the Negro Leagues, terrific hitter. He goes. At the end, they started calling him captain when he was 22 years old. He was always above. But he goes on to manage that Negro Leagues team, and he manages the Monarchs to pennants. He's the coach of Ernie Banks, the manager of Ernie Banks, so on. Becomes a scout. Time where there were very few black scouts, and he scouts Ernie Banks. He sent Ernie Banks to as manager to the Cubs, but he signs Lou Brock for the Cubs. He signs Lee Smith for the Cubs. He signs Joe Carter for the Cubs. Oscar Gamble. I mean, he's one of the most successful scouts in baseball history, and a legend among scouts. You want to hear people talk about treasuring Buck O'Neil? Talk to scouts, because scouts just love Buck, and you'll see pictures. There's a great video, like a news report from the 70s. Of a very, very young J.R. Richard growing up in Louisiana, and he was a phenom as both a hitter and a pitcher. And they had like 40 scouts around him. There was one black scout in that group, and that was Buck O'Neil.
Yeah.
And so you go on there. He becomes the first African American coach in Major League Baseball history for the Chicago Cubs, and they never let him coach on the field. Never let him be a third base coach or even a first base coach. Even when people got thrown out of games, they never let him coach. And he found out later that people had told, you ever let that guy on the field,
you don't get him off.
You won't get him off field.
You're not gonna get him off.
He'll be the manager of this team. And then, of course, becomes this incredible ambassador to the game, the spokesman. But it's just an incredible baseball life. And so when you walk into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and you see Babe Ruth, and you see Willie Mays, and you see Henry Aaron, and you see, on and on and on, commissioners and umpires, and nobody lived the life of Buck O'Neil. I mean, you look at the life of Buck O'Neil as baseball. He always told the story we love. You've probably heard it, but he heard that sound 3 times in his life. 3 times he heard a special sound of the ball coming off the bat. He would tell the story all the time. But I think of that story differently now. Because he heard that sound 3 times. The ball coming off the bat sounding like a thunder crack. The first time he heard it, he's a little kid in Sarasota. There's spring training baseball going on. He's on the other side of the fence. He's not watching. He hears the sound, he gets on the ladder, climbs up, sees who it is, and it's Babe Ruth hitting the ball. Years later, he's playing for the Kansas City Monarchs. He's in the clubhouse getting ready. He's not even dressed. He hears the sound again. He always said, I ran on the field. I didn't have anything on but my jockstrap. And he looks and sees who created that sound, and it's Josh Gibson. And then many years later, he's a scout for the Kansas City Royals, and he's at the stadium, and he's watching a young kid hit the ball, and he hears that sound for the third time, and it's Bo Jackson. And I think about that story. I always loved that story. But I think about that story now. He's here in Cooperstown. Mm-hmm. Who else lived that life?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And that's why he said, don't feel sorry for me.
Mm-hmm.
People will always come up to him. Mr. O'Neal, so sorry that you didn't get a chance to play in the Major League. And he would always tell them, and he was sincere about this. Oh no, don't feel sorry for me. Feel sorry for the people who didn't see me play. They're the ones who missed out. And he felt that sincerely. And that's why he spoke about being right on time. Mm-hmm. Because he said had he been born later, he doesn't get that experience of seeing that skinny-legged guy with the barrel chest and the sweetest wing he ever seen, Babe Ruth hitting the ball. Or he doesn't get to compete against Josh Gibson. He wouldn't have had that opportunity to rub shoulders with Bo Jackson, who he absolutely adored. Mm-hmm. And so he saw life a little bit differently than most people did. And that's the perspective that he wanted people to take. So when he stood there on the platform that Sunday in 2006, and we've heard him say this on many occasions. I've done a lot of things I like doing. I hit the home run. Mm-hmm. I hit the grand slam home run. I've had a hole-in-one in golf. I shook hands with President Truman. I shook hands with President Clinton. And I hugged Hillary. But I'd rather be right here, right now, than any place I've ever been in my life. We heard him say that on countless occasions. And y'all, every time he said that, he meant it. Wherever he was in that moment was where he wanted to be, because it was the most important place, because he was there in that moment. And that's what he wanted people to carry with them. Yeah, and so come Sunday, when he is finally taking his place amongst the immortals of this game, I'm sure I'll go back and reflect on that speech, and I was telling Joe, and we've heard him, he was sick at that time. And we didn't know how sick it was, because he really never let on that he was sick. And y'all, he willed himself to be here that day. He was not going to miss that moment to be there to represent those, as Joe mentioned earlier, who built the bridge. And I go back, and after watching the speech again, I go back to one thing that he said, and it wasn't what he said, but the emphatic way in which he said it. And maybe it was because perhaps he knew his fate. And he said, I'm proud to be a Negro League. I never heard him include that in that speech, ever. And he wanted people to know just what it meant to play in the Negro Leagues, and he was indeed proud.
Buying your first home is a huge milestone, but the journey there can be confusing. First Federal Bank of Kansas City is here to make it simple. After nearly a century of serving the KC community, our loan advisors have experience in every type of housing market. With a short phone call, we can give you a free rate quote and talk through loan options. No pressure, no obligation. The road to home ownership can be simple with First Federal Bank. Get started with a free quote at ffbkc.com/homes. First Federal Bank of Kansas City, because banking is personal. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
Hey, it's Blair. We have a special subscription offer for SportsBeat KC listeners, unlimited digital access to the Kansas City Star's award-winning sports coverage. Sign up now for 1 year of Sports Pass for access to all the sports news, features, and columns presented on the kansascity.com site, and it's only $30. That's a 40% savings off our regular rate. Your subscription will automatically renew after the initial term at $50 unless you tell us to cancel. Your subscription helps support the sports coverage of kansascity.com and the Kansas City Star, and that support has never been more important. Please visit kansascity.com/SportsBeatKC offer to get this special offer. And as always, thanks for listening. We've heard from Buck O'Neil, Bob Kendrick, and Joe Posnanski. Here's a conversation between filmmaker Ken Burns and Vahe Gregorian in advance of the Hall of Fame ceremony.
But maybe the place to start is just, what does this mean to you for him to be in there? And I wonder if we could go back a little bit to just the place he came to hold in your heart, or still holds in your heart, obviously.
I kind of have to turn it upside down and just start with that. I mean, I don't know anyone who's had a more profound effect on my life in terms of reminding us of our possibilities as human beings. Buck was a mentor. Buck was a father figure. Buck was a dear friend. He considered his grandchildren, my daughter Sarah with an H on her honeymoon, detoured hundreds of miles out of the way to go to the hospital room in Kansas City. That would be his final stay, and he admonished my son-in-law to take good care of my granddaughter. I mean, he was everything to us, a member of the family. I can't put it any better. At his memorial service in Kansas City, after his funeral and being laid to rest in the cemetery at Memorial Hall, I gave a kind of I don't know if you call it a eulogy or just a remembrance or whatever, but I said that, our religious traditions suggest that man is made in God's image, and there is almost nothing in our behavior that suggests that could be even remotely true until you meet somebody like Buck, and you begin to see what a higher form of being could be. That is to say, in a world that worships and tends towards violence and confrontation, he was about love and peace and forgiveness. And, he lived out some really basic values that then became an example for everybody else around him. One was of joyfulness. He made you feel, if you met him, like you were the person that he had woken up to meet that day. And in that early in the morning, we had these arduous, multi-city promotional tour stuff. We'd be in Atlanta, and we'd get up before 6, and we'd be coming down the elevator, and he'd meet somebody as if the whole purpose of his day was to say hello to this person. And then after 18 hours of work, we'd be stumbling back at midnight, and he'd meet somebody in the elevator going back up, and he would just turn the light on, and you would just watch them be transformed. He was just a gift, some, angel that, for all his 95 years, it still wasn't enough. And so, to answer your first question, him going into the Hall of Fame elevates the Hall of Fame.
That's right. That's exactly right.
I mean, Buck had deserved this honor in his lifetime and didn't get it, but we're all tested in different ways, and Buck passed that test magnificently without a murmur of complaint, and he bore it like the extraordinary sort of baseball god that he was and is, and gave us all a lesson in humility and avarice and ambition, and then now he's in, and he's just, by the very virtue that he's there, the place suddenly got a little bit more distinguished.
Bob and I have talked about this a lot, and you've obviously given it a lot of thought, and we're struck by it in the moment. In hindsight, Bob has learned to tell himself that one of his favorite baseball moments was what Buck demonstrated after not getting in the Hall of Fame, and obviously we'd all like to have seen it go differently, but It seems like you might see it a little through that lens, that what he was able to give.
What I hope I just said, that's exactly it. He showed us a humility and absence of ambition that would, of course, expose our own, if we're honest, our avarice, our greed. It was exposed by that. And yeah, those of us who reacted. He did not. He maintained something. He knew there was something bigger than all of this, and that then makes him bigger than all of this.
Yeah.
All of our disappointment, all of our sadness, all of the petty, whatever political stuff that delivered that particular verdict at that time. He transcended it, and now he's transcended it again. And so he goes into the whatever the elevation is at Cooperstown, it's now a few feet higher, as opposed to Buck being there.
That's right. I should know this, Ken, but I guess I don't. I don't really know what it was like for you just to start to get to know him and how that dynamic unfolded.
Sure. It begins with my colleague Lynn Novick, who is a co-producer of the baseball series, and she had gone to Cooperstown to film some of the attendees at a Negro League reunion at the Otasaga. And she did a couple of interviews and met some people to interview later, and she said, but this one guy, he's really, really great. And the footage came back, and he was really, really great. And she went back and did another interview, and then I did the third interview, and it was, by that time, we were really close because, as he's told me very late in his life, he said, I've been talking about this all of my life, and nobody listened until you came along. And I said, other way around, Buck, you gave us access to be able to tell a story that was much more complete about the history of the major leagues, a separate but athletically equal league that, more often than not in barnstorming games beat the white major leaguers who were not allowed to play with them professionally on a day job. And when they finally came, Buck was a little bit ahead of it. I mean, a little bit behind, ahead of time, and didn't get in except as a coach and a scout, which he did magnificently. Identifying somebody like an Ernie Banks is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
But he understood that. He watched Jackie and his meteor go streaming by in that one year in 45 that Jackie played with the Monarchs, and understood the trajectory of Jackie, and that he would pull them all. And he was just magnificent in that, and helped us understand and elevate the story of baseball. I don't know any other way. And we just became fast friends, and my daughters loved him. I mean, they flew into his arms when they were gals, and just sat in his lap. And we were leaving at Fan Fest, where we'd been promoting the film in Boston, and we're flying to New York on the shuttle. And Buck walked up to the Delta, I think it was Delta counter, and here is this tall, imposing, handsome black man, me with my long hair and beard, and my two then young daughters who were almost 12 and almost 8. And he said, we'd like to go to New York. Do you have a family plan? She goes, well, yes, sir, we do. And he said, well, we'd like it. He looked at him and then looked at us, and he said, is there a problem? And she said, no, sir. So Sarah with an H and Lily with 3 L's, Lily, and Ken flew with Buck to New York as a family.
That is great.
And whatever money we saved was immaterial in every sense of the word, to just the fact that Buck understood a much larger kinship between human beings that transcended race, that transcended sex, that transcended nationality, that transcended even talent, of which he had an abundance of. he's just great. I mean, I remember we were in Austin, and the guy who ran the Austin PBS station said, "You like barbecue?" And I said, "Yeah." Buck says, "I'm from Kansas City." And so he took us down to Lockhart, like 70 miles below Austin, and a famed Texas barbecue center. And on the way back, as we were watching these gigantic late afternoon storms, maybe a tornado forming in the west, as we were heading north, Buck would tell story after story about hitting for the cycle, and he really had a second inside the park home run, but he kind of feigned a little hitch between shortstop and third and kind of pulled up lame to get his triple. And, telling stories about Satchel Paige that we then, we had already heard a lot of them, and and had a lot of them on film, and their body and their buddy and their revealing and confrontations between Satchel and Josh Gibson, and just, it's just legendary stuff, and you feel like you're sitting at the seat of Zeus, that's Buck.
There's probably no way to quantify this, but I wonder if you can. To what degree you feel like Buck was just really entwined with the whole documentary?
He was its heart and soul.
Yeah.
People who appear more often and advance the narrative in certain ways, but those are kind of intellectual things, structural things. But when somebody becomes the heart of your film, by virtue not of any pre-planning on our part, but by virtue of your own virtues, that's a pretty remarkable thing. We consider the gift of Buck to that film, why the film is still so hugely popular. There are fathers and sons and mothers and daughters and mothers and sons and fathers and daughters that watch every January,
Yeah.
There's no baseball. And that's, I think a lot of it has to do that there is an emotional underpinning to this greatest of all sport. There's nothing compares to it. Nothing compares to it. The only sport in which the defense holds the ball, right? The only sport in which the defense holds the ball, right? The only sport in which the person scores, not the thing, not the puck, not the pigskin, not the basketball. There's no time. Every park is different. How is that possible? In every other sport, everything is exactly the same. The hockey rink has to be certain. The basketball court, the football gridiron, And it's just such an amazing sport with so many interesting facets to it, and that he epitomizes what's so great about it, it seems to me, and made it, an emotional attachment. I mean, when you say, you talk about, I love the other sports. I mean, you say, I remember when Michael Jordan hit that three-pointer at the buzzer and we won, right? Or I remember when Joe Montana hit Jerry, they were down and with just a few seconds left and we won. But a baseball story always begins, and you can ask Bob Costas this, you can ask Bob Kendrick this, you can ask Billy Crystal this, you can ask anybody who loves the game, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the late Stephen Jay Gould, all these people, Roger Angel, who just passed away. They say, well, my mom took me to this game, right? Remember the way the clouds were, or the green of the thing. And, it's like being on the rim of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is the grandest canyon on Earth, but it's also who you see it with, whose hand you're holding, whose eye you catch after you look down into this magnificent chasm. And that's a baseball story. And then you go on to say Mickey Mantle did this, or David Ortiz did that, or, Walter Johnson did this, whatever it was that you saw. Stud Churchill talked about it in the film a lot, too. He said there must have been 500,000 people who were crammed into Cub Park for the number of people who told me they saw Babe Ruth's cold shot. Right?
Right. That's right. Well, it's funny, you hit on this in other ways too, Ken, but you got me thinking about this. When when people ask why does Buck O'Neil going in the Hall of Fame? What would you tell them? What is the? There's so many things in the spectrum of it, of course, but what do you think of when you think of that?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the Hall of Fame is supposed to be just about stats, right? We're not measuring the goodness of somebody. The baseball might withhold that and torture the Pete Roses and the Roger Clemens and the Barry Bonds, who should be in, but shouldn't be in, and that's another thing. But Buck doesn't get in on statistics, right? He falls a little short, didn't play as long, in the Negro Leagues, didn't have as but what he has done in the totality of his life is almost beyond measure. I mean, he helped connect an entire dominant white society to the glories and the thrills of the Negro League baseball, just by speaking in our film and speaking all his life about it to audiences big and small. He had that incredible, that sense of a virtue, of having lived a virtuous life and being an example of a higher form of human being. It's literally, there's no greater compliment. And so I think that we celebrate the fact that here is an exceptional person, right? An exceptional person for whom we've made, at least statistically, a kind of exception because he is, in his totality, the best ambassador that baseball had, in a way that Babe Ruth was. Different than Babe Ruth, but still this very alive thing in which when you met Buck, you never forgot that you met him. I mean, people come up to me all the time. This series is 28 years old. 28 years old, and people come up to me all the time and said, "Oh man, what was Buck like? I had a chance to meet him at an autograph thing in Baltimore, or it was in Detroit, or Seattle, or whatever." And they light up because it felt like they had just recharged their batteries, right? And that's Buck's great gift. He just, as I said, there's nothing more to be said other than his induction at the end of this month elevates the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
That's it. I don't know what else I can say. It's just they are a better place that he is now there. Now he's been there for a while because after he was denied back in 2005 or whenever that was, 2006, Bob Costas and Joe Morgan, the late Joe Morgan, and I made a big stink, and we didn't stop yelling and screaming until we turned blue in the face. And there's a statue there of Buck right there when you come in, and it's people see it and people ask questions about it, and that's a good thing. And maybe it's even better than just having an indistinguished plaque, but it's not. He needs to be among the greatest people who ever played baseball. So he's now there. And because he is now there, or will be there, it's a better place. The game's a better game, and the Hall of Fame is a better representation of the glories of baseball's glorious past.
I am so grateful you've made this time. I know you got to go in a minute, and the only thing I can really think beyond all these remarkable thoughts you've had is just to make sure I ask, is there anything that you wanted to make sure to express that I didn't properly ask you? Or?
There was an interesting thing. My daughter Sarah and I and Lynn Novick and her young son James, whose middle name is Jordan, named after Buck's middle name. After the memorial service, we all retired to the plaza. I don't need to explain where that was. Right. To a restaurant, I can't remember, but there was an upstairs, and Bob Costas was there, and John Schuerhoff, then an executive with the Braves, and Brett was there, George Brett and Joe, and there may have been one other person, and they just told Buck stories, and then they became baseball stories, and we laughed and laughed and laughed, all of us deeply touched and influenced by this man. And to watch, Sarah was by then, an adult, but to watch James and to watch his eyes in the face of people that he'd heard about, like George Brett and Joe Morgan, Hall of Famers, and John Scherhoff, who had it. There's Bob Costas, the greatest, arguably one of the greatest baseball announcers of all time. Certainly one of the great broadcasters, period, of all time. A dear friend of mine. And just shooting the shit and telling stories. It just felt like it was a long day. It was a sad day, from the funeral at the AME church and the procession and the closing down of the highway and burial, and then the memorial stuff, and we're lost in our thoughts and our own individual stuff. And then this evening had a kind of just a permanence that I'll never forget. It was the crossing of the barriers of all these people who had different lives, different interests, and different things, but had all come together for Buck. And that's the way Buck was his whole life for us, right? Crossing, racial lines, rich, poor, any section of the country, any country in the world. He just reminded us of the humanness. And there was something timeless and unforgettable about that. I'm a busy person, and I got the next thing that's coming. And I'll never forget, there was a kind of ineffable happiness and peace there the day that we had said goodbye to Buck, because we knew that he's got a kind of immortality from the way he touched our lives, and he now has an immortality, the bigger game of baseball, which he deserves richly.
That'll do it for today. Thanks to our SportsBeat KC staff of Randy Mason, Monty Davis, Jeff Rosen, and Chris Fickett. And a salute to our sponsor, First Federal Bank. Their website is ffbkc.com. I can't thank Vahe Gregorian enough for his coverage of the Buck O'Neil Hall of Fame induction and his interviews that created today's show. The Hall of Fame ceremony, plus the day in baseball, auto racing, golf, and much more was covered in today's morning sports edition. Go to liveedition.kansascity.com for more information. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another SportsBeat KC.